Margaret slapped the bank statement onto the dinner table, and every fork stopped halfway to every mouth. The paper skidded across the polished walnut and struck Claire Bennett's water glass, sending a clear ring of condensation over the black ink. Beneath the chandelier's warm amber light, the missing transfer stood circled in red. $84,000 withdrawn from their grandmother Evelyn's family trust 3 days before she entered assisted living. The dining room smelled of roasted turkey, sage stuffing, and the lemon oil Margaret used on furniture before guests arrived. No one reached for the food. Claire remained seated near the end of the table, one hand resting beside her folded napkin, while Aunt Margaret stood at the head as if she had called a board meeting instead of a Sunday dinner. "Are you too ashamed to tell the truth?" Margaret asked. Her silver earrings swung slightly when she leaned forward, and the narrow heel of one shoe pressed into the hardwood with a faint click. Claire looked at the statement, then at the 14 relatives watching her beneath the steady hum of the heating vent. Her cousin Daniel stopped chewing. Her mother, Elaine, held a serving spoon above the mashed potatoes until gravy dripped from its edge onto the white tablecloth. Margaret's husband lowered his wineglass without drinking. Claire did not reach for the document. "Just wait," she replied. The words were quiet enough that Margaret tilted her head, uncertain whether she had heard correctly. Then a thin smile appeared across her face. "Wait for what?" Claire lifted her water glass and set it farther from the spreading ring. The glass felt cold and slick against her fingertips. Tuesday. A clock chimed once in the hallway. Margaret laughed, but the sound carried no warmth. "You have had 6 weeks." She picked up the statement and held it where everyone could see. 6 weeks since the bank notified me that money disappeared while you had access to your grandmother's accounts." Claire's mother finally lowered the serving spoon. It touched the bowl with a dull ceramic knock. "Margaret, perhaps we should discuss this privately." "We tried privately," Margaret said. Claire refused to explain. She turned back toward her niece. "You managed Evelyn's bills. You collected her mail. You took her to the bank. Then $84,000 vanished, and suddenly you resigned from your accounting firm." Several faces shifted toward Claire at once. A chair creaked near the window. The room had grown too warm, yet Claire's hands remained still on the table. She wore a simple navy blouse with the sleeves rolled once at the wrists, and a faint indentation crossed the bridge of her nose where reading glasses had rested through long nights of reviewing documents. "My resignation has nothing to do with grandmother's trust," she said. Margaret tapped the statement with one lacquered fingernail. "Then tell everyone why you left." Claire's gaze settled on the red circle. "Not tonight." "Of course not." Margaret walked slowly around the table, carrying the page like evidence before a jury. Her perfume, sharp with gardenia and musk, moved ahead of her. "Because the truth makes you look exactly like what the bank records suggest." Elaine pushed back her chair. The legs scraped loudly across the floor. "That is enough." Margaret stopped beside Claire. "No, it is not. Evelyn spent 40 years saving that money. She trusted this family to protect her. Claire was the only person who could access the account without calling me first." Claire turned her head. Margaret's face was less than 3 feet away, carefully composed beneath soft makeup and perfectly arranged blonde-gray hair. "You were co-trustee," Claire said. "On paper," Margaret answered. "You handled the transactions. And you received every monthly statement." Margaret's fingers tightened around the page. "Which is how I found what you were hiding." A low murmur moved along the table. Claire's cousin whispered something to his wife. Elaine pressed both palms against the tablecloth, leaving shallow wrinkles in the linen. Margaret saw the room, leaning toward her, and straightened. Her voice became softer, almost sympathetic. "There is still time to admit it. Tell us you made a mistake. Tell us the money can be returned. We are family." Claire looked toward the empty chair reserved for Evelyn, a place Margaret had insisted on setting despite knowing her mother could no longer attend crowded dinners. The porcelain plate remained untouched beneath a folded ivory napkin. Beside it sat Evelyn's old silver butter knife, its handle worn smooth from decades of use. Claire reached across and moved the knife away from the edge before it could fall. "Family does not accuse first and verify later," she said. Margaret's smile disappeared. "The bank verified the withdrawal. The bank verified a transfer. From Evelyn's trust. Yes. Authorized through your login. Yes." The room tightened around that single answer. Elaine's fingers curled into the tablecloth. Margaret's husband stared down at his plate. Outside, a delivery truck rattled over the street, briefly vibrating the window panes. Margaret placed the statement directly in front of Claire. Then there is nothing left to discuss. Claire finally picked it up. The paper was warm from Margaret's hand and rough along the folded edge. She studied the red circle, not because she needed to read it, but because she recognized the photocopy. It was missing the second page. "Where is the rest of the statement?" she asked. Margaret blinked once. "That is the relevant page. The transfer description continues on the back. Do not change the subject." Claire turned the sheet over. Blank white paper faced the room. Margaret had copied only the page that displayed the withdrawal, not the receiving account, authorization code, or bank notation printed after it. Claire placed the incomplete document beside her plate. Tuesday morning, the probate court will review the trust activity, the bank's internal records, and every authorization connected to that transfer. Margaret folded her arms. "You think a hearing will rescue you?" "No." Claire rose and lifted her coat from the back of the chair. The wool felt coarse beneath her palm, still cool from the entryway. "I think the complete record will." Margaret stepped into her path. "If you walk out now, everyone will know you have something to hide." Claire buttoned her coat slowly. "They already believe that because you made sure they would." She moved around her aunt, kissed her mother's cheek, and left the dining room without touching her dinner. The front hallway smelled of beeswax and the cold air leaking around the old wooden door. As Claire reached for the brass handle, Margaret called after her. "Tuesday will not change what you did." Claire opened the door, allowing a sharp gust to sweep through the house and stir the incomplete bank statement on the table. "No," she said, looking back once. "It will change who has to answer for it." The front door closed behind Claire with a heavy wooden thud, and the laughter that used to follow Sunday dinners never came. Cold evening air brushed across her face as she crossed the brick walkway toward her sedan, carrying the faint scent of damp maple leaves and chimney smoke drifting through the quiet suburban neighborhood. She placed both hands on the roof of the car before unlocking it, letting the chill from the metal settle into her palms. Through the dining room window, she could still see silhouettes moving around the table. Margaret remained standing, one arm raised as she continued explaining something to the family, while the incomplete bank statement rested beneath the chandelier, like the final word in an argument that had barely begun. Claire slid into the driver's seat without starting the engine. The interior smelled faintly of old leather, peppermint gum, and the stack of legal folders resting on the passenger seat. She picked up the top folder, checked the tab marked Trust Documents, then placed it carefully back where it belonged. Her phone vibrated. The screen displayed 3 unread messages from relatives. One simply read, "Please tell me this isn't true." Another asked, "Why didn't you explain yourself?" Claire locked the screen without answering either one. She drove across town toward a modest office building that remained lit long after neighboring businesses had gone dark. Inside the third-floor suite, recessed lights reflected across polished conference tables while printers hummed softly in distant offices. Claire unlocked the door using her security badge. She no longer worked there, but her resignation agreement allowed temporary access while she completed the transfer of several probate files. The familiar scent of paper, coffee, and fresh toner greeted her as she crossed the quiet reception area. Her name had already been removed from the wall directory downstairs, yet one framed certificate still hung outside the records room because no one had taken it down. Claire walked past it without slowing. She entered the archive room, switched on a narrow desk lamp, and unlocked a gray fireproof cabinet. Rows of neatly labeled binders filled the shelves. She removed one marked Bennett Family Trust and laid it across the desk. The binder opened with a soft crackle. Every authorization form, transaction log, and trustee communication remained filed exactly as she had organized them over the previous 6 years. She turned directly to the transfer Margaret had highlighted. The first page matched the photocopy shown at dinner. The second page contained everything Margaret had hidden. Receiving institution, authorization chain, trustee verification, probate notification code. Claire did not smile. She simply placed colored tabs beside each section before making certified copies. The copier filled the room with warm mechanical sounds while fresh paper emerged carrying the faint smell of heated ink. At nearly the same time, Margaret sat inside her own kitchen, pouring coffee into a white porcelain mug while several relatives remained after dinner. The overhead lights reflected from granite countertops covered with untouched dessert plates. Daniel leaned against the island holding the incomplete bank statement. "She didn't deny the transfer," he said. Margaret stirred her coffee with measured circles. The spoon tapped quietly against the cup. Because she couldn't. Elaine stood near the sink, folding a dish towel into smaller and smaller squares. She asked where the second page was. Margaret looked up immediately. There wasn't another page. Elaine met her eyes, but said nothing. Daniel unfolded the photocopy once more. The bank usually prints transaction details on the back. Margaret reached over and took the paper from him. "That information isn't important." Elaine's fingers stopped moving. "It might be." Margaret placed the statement flat against the countertop. "Tuesday will settle everything." She sounded certain, but her hand remained resting on the page longer than necessary before lifting away. Back at the office, Claire carried the copied documents into a conference room overlooking downtown lights shimmering across the river. Attorney Michael Harper waited beside the long oak table with 2 legal pads, a laptop, and an unopened bottle of water. His charcoal suit jacket hung neatly across the back of a chair. "I heard about dinner," he said quietly. Claire handed him the copied transaction record instead of answering. He adjusted his glasses and read every page without interruption. The room remained silent except for the muted clicking of computer keys from distant offices and the low vibration of the building's heating system. When he reached the final authorization page, he leaned back slowly. "She only showed the first sheet." Claire nodded. "Exactly." Michael closed the file. "Then Tuesday changes the conversation." Claire gathered the originals into a new binder labeled Court Exhibits. "That was always the plan." He studied her for a moment before asking, "Why didn't you show everyone this tonight?" Claire clipped the binder shut. The metal clasp snapped cleanly into place. "Because if I defended myself in her dining room, she'd say I manufactured the evidence." She slid the binder into a locking briefcase. "In court, every page comes directly from the bank." Michael rose and walked to the window. Streetlights reflected across the glass behind him. "You know she's convinced the family you're guilty." Claire switched off the desk lamp, leaving only city lights filtering into the room. "No," she answered. "She's convinced them to choose before they've seen the truth." As they left the office together, Michael handed her a sealed envelope bearing the probate court's official stamp. "This arrived after you resigned," he said. Claire examined the unopened envelope beneath the hallway lights. The paper felt thick and cool between her fingers. She slipped it carefully into her briefcase without breaking the seal, locked the office door behind her, and walked toward the elevator knowing that whatever waited inside that envelope would be opened for the first time only when everyone who had already judged her was sitting in the same courtroom. Edit Monday morning arrived with the muted rhythm of courthouse security gates opening and closing, the soft echo of polished shoes crossing stone floors, and the smell of brewed coffee drifting from a kiosk beside the entrance. Claire climbed the granite steps carrying a black leather briefcase close against her side, while the cool brass handrail brushed lightly beneath her fingertips. She paused only long enough to look at the courthouse clock mounted above the main doors. 8:43. The probate hearing would begin at 9. She entered through the security checkpoint, placed her briefcase onto the conveyor belt, and waited while the X-ray monitor glowed pale blue beneath fluorescent lights. The security officer handed the case back with a polite nod. "Good luck today," he said after noticing the probate file label. Claire thanked him quietly and continued toward the elevators. At nearly the same time, Aunt Margaret arrived through the front entrance wearing a cream-colored blazer, pearl necklace, and carefully pressed navy skirt. The sharp scent of expensive perfume followed her into the marble lobby. Daniel walked beside her carrying a leather folder containing the same incomplete bank statement she had displayed during Sunday dinner. Margaret smiled politely at relatives gathering near the courtroom doors. "Once this is finished," she said, smoothing one sleeve, "everyone will finally understand why I had to confront her." Several family members nodded uneasily. Elaine stood apart from the group near a tall courthouse window, twisting a folded tissue between her fingers while morning sunlight stretched pale rectangles across the polished floor. She watched Claire step out of the elevator carrying only her briefcase and one sealed envelope bearing the probate court's official seal. Claire greeted no one except her mother. She touched Elaine's shoulder gently before continuing toward attorney Michael Harper, who waited outside courtroom 3 with a stack of organized binders resting on a rolling case. "Everything ready?" he asked. Claire handed him the sealed envelope she had protected since Friday night. "This stays unopened until the judge asks for the court submission." Michael examined the unbroken seal beneath the hallway lights before slipping it into the top compartment of his case. "Understood." Margaret noticed the exchange from across the corridor. She leaned toward Daniel. "More paperwork," she whispered. "She's trying to bury the issue." Daniel looked uncertain. "Or answer it." Margaret's expression hardened only for a moment before she smiled again as another cousin approached. Courtroom 3 smelled faintly of varnished wood, old paper, and the dry warmth rising from cast-iron radiators beneath tall windows. Sunlight filtered through narrow panes, illuminating suspended dust above the counsel tables. Claire sat beside Michael without opening her briefcase. Margaret chose the opposite table, arranging her documents carefully until the incomplete bank statement rested directly on top. Family members quietly filled the rear benches. Elaine remained in the second row, both hands folded tightly around her purse. At precisely 9 o'clock, the courtroom deputy announced the judge's arrival. Chairs shifted softly across the hardwood floor as everyone stood. The judge entered, adjusted his reading glasses, and reviewed the docket before inviting both parties to proceed. Margaret stood almost immediately. Her voice carried confidently through the quiet courtroom. "Your Honor, this matter concerns an unexplained withdrawal of $84,000 from the Bennett family trust while my niece, Claire Bennett, exercised financial control over my mother's daily affairs." She placed the photocopied statement before the judge. "This document reflects the transaction." The judge glanced briefly at the page before setting it aside. "Counsel." Michael rose calmly. "Your Honor, before testimony begins, the petitioner has submitted only one page of a 2-page banking record." Margaret looked toward him sharply. "The second page is administrative." Michael did not answer her. Instead, he addressed the court. "We ask permission to submit the certified complete record obtained directly from First Federal Bank." The judge nodded. "Granted." Michael reached for the sealed envelope. Every eye in the courtroom followed the movement. The official seal cracked softly as he opened it for the first time. Fresh paper slid onto the counsel table beneath the overhead lights. He handed the complete certified packet to the courtroom clerk, who immediately carried it to the judge. The only sound came from pages turning one after another. Margaret folded her arms. Her polished smile remained, but one finger began tapping lightly against her elbow. The judge read silently for nearly a minute before looking up. "Mrs. Collins," he said, "were you aware that this certified record includes continuation pages omitted from your submission?" Margaret answered without hesitation. "Those pages don't change the withdrawal." "Perhaps," the judge replied evenly, "but they appear relevant." Claire remained seated, her hands resting quietly on the edge of the counsel table. She neither interrupted nor reacted while the certified documents continued moving between the judge, the clerk, and opposing counsel. Michael simply waited. Margaret finally accepted the packet. As she turned the pages herself, the confidence in her posture shifted almost imperceptibly. She stopped halfway through the file, read one section again, then continued turning pages more slowly than before. Daniel leaned toward her. She covered part of the document with her hand before he could read it clearly. Across the courtroom, Elaine noticed the movement and looked toward Claire for the first time that morning. Claire offered no expression beyond quiet patience. The judge placed both hands together atop the bench. "This hearing will proceed using the certified complete record submitted directly by the financial institution," he said. "Any incomplete copies previously presented will not serve as primary evidence." Margaret lowered her papers onto the table. The photocopied statement she had relied upon all week now lay partly hidden beneath the thicker certified file. Claire reached into her briefcase, removed one additional binder, labeled Trust Authorization Logs, and slid it silently toward Michael. He opened it, glanced once at the index tabs, then looked at Claire with the slightest nod. The hearing had not yet reached testimony, yet for the first time since Sunday dinner, the room no longer belonged to the accusation. The judge adjusted his glasses and turned toward Margaret while the radiator beneath the tall windows clicked softly, releasing dry heat that carried the faint smell of old varnish and paper through the courtroom. "Mrs. Collins," he said, "you may continue, but your testimony must address the complete banking record." Margaret rose from her chair. Her cream blazer caught the pale morning light, and the pearls at her throat shifted as she crossed to the witness stand. The wooden gate closed behind her with a clean latch. She placed one hand on the Bible, repeated the oath, and sat with her spine straight against the hardback chair. Michael remained at counsel table while Margaret's attorney began with questions designed to restore the certainty she had carried into the room. She described Evelyn's trust, Claire's access to the household accounts, and the morning she discovered the $84,000 transfer. Her voice stayed smooth. Each answer arrived polished, as if rehearsed before a mirror. "And what did Ms. Bennett tell you when you asked about the money?" her attorney said. Margaret glanced toward Claire. She refused to explain. Claire's fingers rested beside the indexed binder. The black leather felt cool beneath her palm. "Did she deny authorizing the transfer?" "No." "Did she provide you with any document showing a legitimate purpose?" "No." Margaret turned slightly toward the family benches, allowing the answer to reach them. "She simply expected us to trust her." Michael stood for cross-examination. His chair moved back with a muted scrape across the hardwood. He approached the witness stand carrying only the certified bank packet, not the thicker authorization binder. "Mrs. Collins, you were co-trustee of the Bennett Family Trust?" "Yes." "You received monthly statements?" "Yes." "You had online access?" Margaret hesitated for less than a second. "Limited access. Enough to review transactions?" "Yes." Michael placed the complete statement on the evidence rail. The paper made a dry whisper against polished wood. "Please turn to page 2. Margaret did not immediately move. The judge looked up. "Mrs. Collins?" She opened the packet. "Read the receiving institution aloud." Margaret's eyes moved across the line. "Lakeview Senior Care Escrow Services." A murmur traveled through the rear benches. Elaine's purse clasp snapped softly as her hand tightened around it. Michael continued. "And the transfer description?" Margaret swallowed. "Prepaid residential care deposit." "For whom?" "Evelyn Bennett." The courtroom seemed to contract around the words. Sunlight shifted across the witness stand, illuminating the red polish on Margaret's fingernails as they pressed against the page. Michael allowed the silence to remain before asking. "So the money did not enter Claire Bennett's personal account?" "Not according to this page. It did not purchase a car, pay her rent, or cover personal debt." "No." "It secured your mother's placement at Lakeview Senior Care?" Margaret's jaw tightened. "That appears to be what the record says." Michael turned toward the clerk. "Your Honor, Defense Exhibit 7 includes the executed residency agreement and the escrow confirmation issued the same day." Claire opened the authorization binder and handed him the tabbed documents. She moved without haste, but every eye followed the file from her hands to his. The clerk marked the exhibit. Pages turned beneath the soft hum of fluorescent lights. Margaret's attorney leaned closer to her notes. The confident rhythm of her pen had stopped. Michael returned to the witness stand. "Mrs. Collins, were you informed that Lakeview required an immediate deposit to hold the only available memory care suite?" "I don't recall." "Were you present when the facility administrator explained that the reservation would expire at 5 p.m.? "I was present for part of the meeting." "Did you leave before the financial discussion concluded?" Margaret looked toward Claire again. "I had another appointment." "A salon appointment?" Her attorney stood. "Objection. Relevance," Michael said. "The witness has suggested she was excluded from the decision. Her reason for leaving bears on whether that exclusion was voluntary." The judge nodded. "Overruled." Margaret's fingers shifted against the witness rail. "Yes, I had an appointment. And before leaving, did you tell Claire to handle whatever was necessary?" "I may have said something similar." Michael lifted a signed trustee authorization. "Is this your signature?" Margaret stared at the page. The courtroom clock ticked once, twice. "Yes." "The document authorizes Claire to transfer up to $90,000 from the trust for Evelyn Bennett's residential care." Margaret's attorney stopped writing entirely. Claire did not look toward the family benches. She watched Margaret, the same woman who had held half a statement over the Sunday dinner table and demanded truth from everyone except herself. "I signed several documents that day," Margaret said. "I didn't read every line." Michael lowered the paper. "But you later presented the transfer as theft." "Because Claire refused to explain." She sent you the escrow receipt by certified email 36 minutes after the transfer. Margaret's face changed only slightly, but her shoulders moved back from the microphone. I received many emails. The system records show you opened that one twice. Daniel leaned forward behind her. Elaine closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. Michael placed the delivery confirmation beside the authorization form. Once at 6:14 p.m. and again the following morning at 7:32. The radiator knocked sharply beneath the window. Margaret stared at the two timestamps as if distance might alter them. Her attorney whispered something, but she lifted one hand without turning. I was protecting my mother, she said. By accusing Claire publicly? Michael asked. By forcing the truth out. The truth was already in your inbox. Margaret's mouth opened, but no answer came. The judge leaned forward. Mrs. Collins, did you know before Sunday dinner that the $84,000 had been transferred to secure Evelyn Bennett's care? Margaret's gaze moved from the judge to Claire, then toward the relatives seated behind counsel tables. The perfume that had filled the hallway now seemed overwhelmed by the dry heat and bitter courthouse coffee. Her fingers released the rail one at a time. Yes, she said at last. The admission fell quietly, yet every person in the room heard it. Claire remained seated as Margaret lowered her eyes to the complete statement. Michael returned to counsel table and closed the binder. The judge removed his glasses. Then this hearing is no longer about whether Ms. Bennett concealed the truth, he said. It is about why you chose to conceal it. Edit Margaret remained in the witness chair while the silence spread farther than any objection had managed to reach. The old courtroom clock ticked steadily above the judge's bench, and the dry warmth from the radiators mixed with the faint scent of courthouse coffee drifting in whenever the rear doors opened. Her incomplete photocopy now rested beneath the certified banking records, almost hidden by the thicker stack of official documents. She adjusted the sleeve of her cream blazer, but the movement lacked the confidence with which she had entered the courtroom only an hour earlier. The judge rested both hands on the bench. Mrs. Collins, you testified that your niece refused to explain the transfer. Margaret nodded once. Yes. Yet the evidence before this court shows you received the escrow receipt, the trustee authorization, and the confirmation from the care facility before the family dinner. Margaret looked toward her attorney before answering. I saw the emails. Did you read them? Some of them. Did any of those documents indicate that Claire Bennett transferred funds into her own account? Margaret lowered her eyes to the paperwork. No. The judge glanced toward the family seated behind the counsel tables. Several relatives shifted quietly on the wooden benches. Daniel rubbed one hand across the back of his neck while Elaine stared at the polished floorboards between her shoes. Claire remained seated beside Michael Harper with both hands folded calmly over the closed authorization binder. She neither celebrated nor interrupted. Michael stood once more. Your Honor, the defense requests permission to admit one additional exhibit. Proceed. He opened the binder to a tab marked Care Facility Communications. The pages released a soft crackling sound as they turned beneath the overhead lights. These are certified correspondence records between Lakeview Senior Care, Mrs. Collins, and Ms. Bennett covering the week before Evelyn Bennett moved into assisted living. The clerk accepted the documents and carried them to the bench. Margaret's attorney leaned forward. Your Honor, we have not reviewed those pages. You will have the opportunity, the judge replied. Michael waited until every copy had been distributed before speaking again. Mrs. Collins, please review page 4. Margaret accepted the packet. Her fingertips paused against the paper when she recognized the subject line printed across the top. Reservation expiration notice. Would you read the highlighted sentence aloud? Michael asked. Margaret hesitated. The courtroom remained still except for the quiet whir of the ceiling ventilation. Finally she read. Failure to receive the required escrow deposit by 5 p.m. will result in cancellation of the reserved memory care suite. Michael nodded. And below that, she continued more quietly. Alternative placement cannot be guaranteed because current occupancy is at full capacity. Michael walked slowly back toward counsel table before turning again. Who was physically present when the facility administrator explained that deadline? Claire and I. Who stayed to complete the paperwork after you left? Margaret answered without looking up. Claire. Who signed the transfer after you authorized her to proceed? Claire. Who ensured your mother did not lose her placement? Margaret's fingers tightened around the page. Claire. The answer settled heavily over the courtroom. Daniel lowered his head. Elaine released the tissue she had been twisting since morning. It fell gently into her lap. Margaret's attorney stood and approached the witness stand, attempting to regain control of the testimony. Mrs. Collins, despite these documents, you genuinely believed more explanation was necessary before the transfer occurred, correct? Margaret looked toward Claire. Their eyes met for the first time since the hearing began. Claire's expression remained unchanged. No challenge. No satisfaction. Only patient attention. Margaret turned back toward her attorney. I believed she stopped. The unfinished sentence lingered in the room. The attorney tried again. You believed your concerns were justified? Margaret swallowed. The pearls around her neck shifted slightly with the movement. I believe Claire should have answered me immediately. Michael rose. Your Honor, may I redirect? The judge nodded. Michael approached the witness stand once more. Mrs. Collins, when Claire said, just wait. At Sunday dinner, was Tuesday's hearing already scheduled? Yes. Did you know these certified records would be presented here? Margaret closed her eyes briefly before opening them again. Yes. So when you demanded that she tell the family the truth, you already knew the court would review the complete truth 48 hours later? Margaret's voice dropped almost to a whisper. Yes. No one moved. Even the scratching pens of the courtroom reporters had stopped. Michael returned to his seat without another question. The judge studied the witness for several long seconds before removing his glasses. Mrs. Collins, he said evenly, this court is concerned not only with financial stewardship, but with the conduct of trustees toward one another. Public accusations based on incomplete records carry consequences well beyond accounting. Margaret slowly climbed down from the witness stand. The wooden step gave a dull creak beneath her heel. She walked back to counsel table carrying the complete file instead of the single photocopied page she had relied upon for weeks. As she sat, Daniel quietly reached for the old photocopy still lying beside her legal pad. He looked at the missing second page, then folded the incomplete document in half and slipped it beneath the certified record without saying a word. Across the aisle, Claire opened her briefcase, removed one final sealed folder labeled Trustee Communication Log, and placed it gently in front of Michael. He glanced at the label, then toward the judge, who announced a brief recess before the next phase of testimony. As attorneys gathered their papers and family members slowly rose from the benches, Margaret's eyes settled on the unopened folder resting before Claire, realizing there was still one complete record left that no one in the courtroom had yet seen. The courtroom doors opened again after the short recess, their brass hinges giving a low metallic sigh that echoed beneath the high ceiling. Afternoon sunlight stretched farther across the hardwood floor, warming the polished oak railings while the scent of fresh coffee drifted from paper cups carried back by attorneys returning to their tables. Claire placed her briefcase carefully beneath the defense table before sliding the sealed folder labeled Trustee Communication Log toward Michael Harper. The white security seal remained unbroken. Across the aisle, Margaret sat quietly for the first time that morning. The folded photocopy had disappeared beneath the certified records, replaced by neatly stacked exhibits she no longer touched. The judge resumed his seat, adjusted the microphone, and nodded toward Michael. You may proceed with your next witness or exhibit. No additional witness, Your Honor, Michael replied. The defense requests admission of the trustee communication log maintained automatically by the trust management system. The clerk accepted the sealed folder. The paper seal cracked with a crisp sound that carried clearly through the silent courtroom. Inside rested printed correspondence, certified delivery reports, and timestamp records arranged in chronological order. The judge examined the cover page before passing copies to opposing counsel. Margaret's attorney turned several pages rapidly, then slowed as each communication appeared in sequence. Michael remained standing. Mrs. Collins testified repeatedly that Claire refused to explain the transfer. These records show every communication sent before and after the escrow payment. The judge nodded. Proceed. Michael approached the evidence monitor positioned beside the witness stand. The screen illuminated with a pale blue glow. Before displaying the first message, the subject line read, "Immediate signature needed before 5 p.m. date?" Michael asked. 3 days before the transfer. The clerk answered after checking the exhibit. Recipients. Margaret Collins and Claire Bennett. Michael selected the next page. A confirmation report appeared beneath it. Delivery successful. Then another page. Opened by Margaret Collins at 2:18 p.m. Another. Reply requested. Another. No response received. The monitor continued displaying message after message. Each carried timestamps accurate to the minute. Claire's outgoing emails appeared alongside certified delivery receipts. Margaret's inbox confirmations followed immediately afterward. Michael never raised his voice. He simply advanced the record one page at a time, while the soft clicks of the presentation remote became the loudest sound in the courtroom. Daniel watched each screen change without shifting in his seat. Elaine pressed both hands together over her purse, her eyes moving between the monitor and Margaret. Michael stopped at one final communication dated the evening after the transfer. "Please read the first paragraph aloud," he said to the clerk. The clerk adjusted her glasses. "Margaret, the payment has secured Mom's suite. Attached are the escrow receipt, bank confirmation, signed trustee authorization, and admission schedule. I know this process has been stressful, but everything is documented for your review. If you have questions, let's discuss them before speaking with the rest of the family." Silence settled again. The judge leaned slightly forward. "Was this email opened?" "Yes, Your Honor," the clerk replied after checking the metadata. "Twice." Michael pressed the remote once more. The final page displayed no reply from Margaret. Only the system notation appeared at the bottom. Conversation closed by recipient. Margaret stared at the screen. The pale light reflected across her pearl necklace and the polished surface of the counsel table. Her attorney whispered quietly, but she did not answer. Michael returned to counsel table and rested one hand on the binder. "Claire never avoided the truth," he said. "She documented it, delivered it, and invited discussion before any accusation was made." The judge folded his hands. "Mrs. Collins, would you like to respond before the court moves forward?" Margaret inhaled slowly. The ventilation system hummed overhead while distant footsteps crossed the hallway beyond the courtroom doors. She rose without being asked and faced the bench instead of Claire. "I received every message," she said. "I saw the attachments." Her voice remained steady, but it carried none of the certainty from earlier testimony. "Then why?" the judge asked. "Did you accuse your niece of hiding the truth?" Margaret looked toward the family benches. Daniel held her gaze for only a moment before lowering his eyes. Elaine remained perfectly still. Margaret turned back toward the bench. "Because I believed if I confronted her publicly, she would finally admit she had done something wrong." "Even after reading the documents?" the judge asked. Margaret nodded once. "Yes." "So the accusation continued after the facts were available to you?" She answered quietly. "Yes." Claire did not interrupt. She reached into her briefcase, removed a stainless steel water bottle, unscrewed the cap, and took a small sip before placing it back beside the binder. The movement was calm, almost ordinary, yet every relative watching seemed to notice how little she had needed to defend herself. The documents had spoken before she ever did. The judge closed the communication log and handed it back to the clerk. "The court accepts Defense Exhibit 8 into evidence." His gavel struck once, the sharp sound echoing against wood and marble. At this stage, the issue before this court has shifted substantially. The remaining question is no longer whether Claire Bennett concealed information. The remaining question is whether deliberate public accusations were made despite full knowledge of the documented facts. Margaret slowly returned to her chair. She placed both hands on the counsel table, but did not touch a single document. Across the aisle, Claire quietly closed her briefcase. Michael leaned toward her and spoke only 4 words that no one else could hear. Claire gave the smallest nod in return. Then the courtroom deputy approached the bench carrying a folded sheet that had just arrived from the clerk's office. The judge read it once, looked toward both counsel tables, and announced that before final arguments could begin, the court had authorized one additional witness requested by neither side, but directly connected to the trust records. The courtroom deputy opened the side door, and a woman in a charcoal pantsuit entered carrying a slim facility binder against her chest. Her low heels clicked across the hardwood, sharp beneath the humming fluorescent lights, while the faint scent of antiseptic and lavender hand lotion followed her toward the witness stand. Claire recognized her immediately. Laura Mitchell, admissions director at Lakeview Senior Care, had been the person who held Evelyn's suite while the family argued over signatures and deadlines. Laura took the oath, adjusted the microphone, and placed the binder across her lap. Margaret's hands tightened against the edge of the counsel table. The judge spoke first. Ms. Mitchell, the court requested your testimony because your name appears throughout the certified trust records. Please explain your involvement. Laura opened the binder to a tab marked Bennett, Evelyn. I coordinated Mrs. Bennett's admission into our memory care program. At the time, we had one suitable private suite available. The reservation required an $84,000 prepaid care deposit by 5 p.m. that Friday. Her voice carried clearly through the courtroom. Papers shifted softly in the rear benches. Who attended the admission meeting? The judge asked. Claire Bennett and Margaret Collins. Laura turned one page. Mrs. Collins identified herself as co-trustee and Evelyn's daughter. Ms. Bennett brought the medical records, insurance information, and trust documents. Michael stood. Did Claire attempt to hide the proposed transfer from Mrs. Collins? No, Laura's answer came without pause. She repeatedly asked that all financial terms be explained to both trustees. Margaret's attorney rose. Objection. Characterization. Overruled, the judge said. The witness may describe what she observed. Laura continued. The air vent above the witness stand released a low rush of warm air, lifting one corner of the admission checklist. Mrs. Collins became frustrated during the financial discussion. She said the paperwork was taking too long and that she had somewhere else to be. Before leaving, she signed the authorization form and told Claire, handle it. That's what you're here for. A wooden bench creaked behind Margaret. Daniel's wife lowered her eyes. Elaine's fingers closed around the strap of her purse. Margaret leaned toward her attorney, but the attorney gently raised one hand, asking her to remain still. Michael approached the witness stand with the signed authorization already marked as evidence. Is this the document you saw Margaret Collins sign? Yes. Did you explain the amount before she signed it? Twice. Did she ask where the money would go? Yes. I told her it would remain in an escrow account controlled by Lakeview and applied only to Evelyn Bennett's care. Michael placed another page on the evidence rail. What happened after Mrs. Collins left? Laura looked toward Claire for the first time. Claire stayed almost 3 hours. She reviewed every clause, called the bank, confirmed the trust permitted prepaid residential care, and refused to authorize the transfer until our finance department provided written confirmation that the deposit would remain refundable under the terms of the residency agreement. The family benches grew completely still. Claire's mother lifted one hand to her mouth. Laura continued. She also negotiated a lower annual rate because Evelyn was committing to long-term care. That reduced the projected cost by approximately $22,000 over 3 years. Margaret's gaze dropped to the certified packet in front of her. The pearls at her throat rose and fell once. Her attorney stood for cross-examination. Ms. Mitchell, isn't it true that Ms. Bennett asked you not to discuss certain medical details with extended family? Yes. Margaret looked up quickly. Her attorney stepped closer. So Claire was withholding information. Laura closed the binder. The leather cover made a soft thump. Against her knee. She was protecting Evelyn's privacy under the healthcare release Evelyn had signed. But Margaret Collins is Evelyn's daughter. Being someone's daughter does not automatically authorize access to protected medical information. The attorney glanced toward Margaret before continuing. Did Claire ever say she was ashamed of Evelyn's condition? Laura's expression changed. No. She said Evelyn deserved to enter care without becoming the subject of family gossip. A quiet sound moved through the courtroom. Not quite a murmur, more like a collective breath released too late. Margaret's attorney returned to counsel table. Laura waited. The judge leaned forward. One final question. Based on your direct observation, who ensured Evelyn Bennett entered the facility before the reservation expired? Claire Bennett. And did Claire receive any personal financial benefit from the transfer? None. The judge thanked Laura and dismissed her. As she passed Claire's table, she did not speak, but placed 2 fingers briefly against the edge of the black leather briefcase, a small gesture that lasted less than a second. The side door closed behind her, and the courtroom returned to silence. The judge reviewed several notes before addressing both parties. The evidence establishes that Claire Bennett acted within her authority, documented the transaction, protected the trust, and secured necessary care for Evelyn Bennett. The evidence also establishes that Margaret Collins knew the purpose of the transfer before publicly accusing her niece of misconduct. Margaret's polished fingernail pressed into her legal pad, leaving a crescent-shaped mark. Effective immediately, the judge continued, Margaret Collins is suspended from exercising independent authority as co-trustee pending final review. Claire Bennett will retain administrative control subject to court supervision. The words changed the room more completely than any raised voice could have. Margaret looked toward Claire as though expecting protest, triumph, or revenge. Claire offered none. She opened the trust binder, removed a prepared oversight schedule, and handed it to Michael. The judge accepted the document and approved the temporary arrangement. Every monthly statement would now be sent to the court, the facility, and both trustees simultaneously. No page could be omitted. No accusation could survive on half a record again. Outside the courtroom, relatives gathered beneath cold white hallway lights while the vending machine near the elevators released the bitter smell of burnt coffee. Margaret emerged last. Her shoes no longer struck the tile with the same sharp rhythm. She stopped directly in front of Claire. "You wanted this," she said quietly. Claire secured the brass clasp on her briefcase. "I wanted grandmother protected. You could have told everyone at dinner." Claire looked past her aunt toward the family members who had watched a photocopy become a verdict. "You already knew." Margaret's mouth tightened. "So what happens now?" Claire lifted the briefcase and met her eyes. "Now you tell them why the truth embarrassed you more than the lie did." The courthouse hallway had emptied by late afternoon, leaving only the muted buzz of fluorescent lights and the distant hum of an elevator moving between floors. The polished tile reflected long bands of pale sunlight from the western windows, while the smell of paper, coffee, and floor wax lingered in the still air. Claire stood beside one of the courthouse benches, fastening the brass clasp on her briefcase, when she heard measured footsteps approaching behind her. Margaret stopped less than 6 feet away. Her cream blazer remained perfectly pressed, but one pearl earring had slipped slightly from its setting, and the folder in her hands no longer rested neatly against her side. Neither woman spoke immediately. The silence lasted long enough for the courthouse clock to strike 4. Elaine stepped quietly into the hallway, followed by Daniel and several relatives who had remained throughout the hearing. No one interrupted. Margaret looked from one familiar face to another before returning her attention to Claire. "You said I already knew," she began, her voice lower than anyone had heard all day. Claire nodded once. Margaret unfolded the certified bank record she had carried since morning. The paper made a dry crackling sound between her fingers. She stared at the complete document instead of the incomplete copy that had started everything. "I didn't know where the money went," she admitted. "I knew before Sunday dinner." Daniel lowered his eyes. Elaine slowly released the strap of her purse. Claire remained still, one hand resting on the handle of her briefcase. Margaret continued speaking, but no longer toward the judge or the attorneys. She spoke directly to her family. "When Mom agreed to move into memory care, I felt like I had failed her." The words came carefully, without performance. Claire handled the appointments. Claire understood the paperwork. Claire spent every afternoon with her. Everyone kept thanking Claire. She paused as a courthouse cart rolled quietly down the far corridor, its wheels rattling faintly over tiled joints before disappearing around a corner. "I told myself I was protecting Mom," Margaret said. "But I was protecting my pride." The hallway remained silent except for the low ventilation system above them. Margaret looked toward Claire for the first time without accusation. "When I saw the transfer, I knew exactly what it paid for. But I convinced myself people would ask questions if I pushed hard enough." She swallowed once. "Instead, they believed what I wanted them to believe." Daniel stepped forward slowly. The leather sole of his shoe brushed softly against the floor. "That's why you never showed the second page." Margaret nodded. "Yes." Elaine covered her mouth with trembling fingers before lowering her hand again. "You let me think my daughter stole from her own grandmother." Margaret's shoulders fell. "Yes." Claire finally spoke. "Why didn't you answer my emails?" Margaret gave a faint, almost defeated smile. "Because every reply would have admitted you were right." The words settled over the family with more force than any courtroom ruling. Claire looked through the courthouse windows where fading sunlight reflected from parked cars outside. She remembered every certified email, every unanswered message, every evening spent reviewing legal documents while relatives quietly decided what kind of person she must be. None of it needed repeating. The evidence had already spoken. Margaret folded the complete statement carefully along its original crease. "I'm sorry," she said. "Not because the court exposed me." She looked directly at Claire. "Because I asked whether you were ashamed to tell the truth when I was the one hiding from it." Claire listened without interrupting. The hallway lights flickered on automatically as daylight weakened beyond the windows. Their cool white glow replaced the fading gold of the afternoon, casting clean reflections across the marble walls. Several relatives shifted uneasily, waiting for Claire to answer. She bent slightly, lifted her briefcase, and held it comfortably at her side. "An apology matters," she said quietly. "But it doesn't erase what happened at that table." Margaret nodded before Claire had even finished speaking. "I know. People trusted your words because you spoke before anyone saw the facts." Margaret closed her eyes briefly. "I know." Claire took one step closer. Neither woman raised her voice. "If you want them to believe the truth now," Claire said, "tell it the same way you told the lie." Margaret looked around at every member of the family gathered in the hallway. No one looked away. She drew one slow breath. "Then all of you deserve to hear this from me." She turned toward them completely. "Claire never stole $1. She protected Mom, protected the trust, and protected our family while I accused her anyway. Everything I said at dinner was built on something I already knew was incomplete." Daniel reached into his jacket pocket and removed the folded photocopy Margaret had distributed on Sunday. Without saying a word, he tore the incomplete copy cleanly in half and dropped both pieces into the nearby recycling bin. The soft rustle of paper echoed more loudly than expected in the quiet hallway. Elaine walked toward Claire and wrapped both hands around hers. The warmth of her mother's touch contrasted with the cool brass handle of the briefcase. She did not cry or speak. She simply held on. Claire squeezed her hands gently before looking back toward Margaret. "I'm keeping my responsibility as trustee," Claire said. "But from today forward, every decision about grandmother will be documented, shared, and reviewed together. No exceptions." Margaret accepted the condition without hesitation. "Agreed." Claire gave one final nod. "Then that's how we move forward." She turned toward the courthouse exit with her mother beside her. Behind them, Margaret remained standing in the center of the hallway holding the complete bank statement in both hands, fully aware that for the first time since asking her niece whether she was ashamed to tell the truth, she had finally spoken it herself. Min Kong Ko Dun Guk and Kwa Kak Fan Truok, Part 1-8, Tuda, Baswan Y9 Fan De Thong, Not Vi Chung Kong Kon Trong Gu, Kan Hien Tai Kwa Kuok Tiaro Chien. Nu Min Tu Viet Teep, Rat De Lam Sai Ten Nan Vat, Dien Bien. Twin Loi John Va Mao Thuan Voi Kich Ban Qua Ban. Vui Long Don Lai Mot Trong Kak Noi Dong Sao. Tone Bo Swan Y9 Fan Va Part 8. Hoke Tone Bo Kak Part Truok. Hoke File Chua Kich Ban. Kai Kon Gukan Du. Min Se Viet Dung Part 9 Theo Chin Zak Kak Ka Qua Ban. Koang 855 2. Tiang On. Mot Koi Vin Ban Due Not. Kit Tuk Tron Vin Dung Loi Hua Qua Tuda. Dong Not Tone Bo Nan Vat Va Chi Teet. Kong Them Bat Ky Loi Dan. Chutik He Din Dang Now Kok.